Very good afternoon to one and all. We are starting the next session. So I will request Dr. Anand to come on the dais and speak in current concepts in management of keratoconus in children. Dr. Anand, your time is 8 minutes and kindly stick to the time.
Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this lovely session. I'd give you a broad overview of what we have been doing as well. So I guess the first question is what is different from adult versus pediatric. One is that here you're treating for long-term visual gain, which is 70, 80 years into the future. The second is the definition of success is slightly different from what we do for adults. The progression of keratoconus, we do know, is a lot more advanced and a lot more faster. You invariably will need post-treatment visual aids, but the challenge will be acceptance of those post-treatment visual aids. An important part about cornea is that the type of collagen is different. The collagen turnover tends to be significantly more. So over a period of time, you may require some patients who may require a repeat treatment, and the response to treatment in our hands is very variable. Some of them have very significant flattening to the treatment. Some of them respond very, very mildly. The second is the symmetry of involvement between eyes. What we find is significantly different. Most times they have asymmetric involvement, and there is a variable depth of the demarcation line. Sometimes there is resistance to acceptance of glasses, and also some of them will require contact lenses. Now, the important point is about early detection. So we do recommend yearly follow-ups for anybody with chronic allergy. The second is, in terms of rapid progression, if there is significant change in the refractive error, more than 1 diopter per year, we do recommend a tomography or a topography. A comprehensive approach doesn't mean only the eye treatment, but also the systemic part, which requires, in about 30 to 40% of patients tend to have associated allergies. We do know that the prevalence is higher in patients with allergies. The progression rates are up to about 20% annually. There is some genetic factors, and in 14 to 16% of the cases, there is a family history, either cousin, sister. We have about 4 families in which brother and sisters are affected. And we've already touched about environmental factors. Now, when we look at diagnosis and early detection, the important part is not only the slit lamp examination, and if you note, I put refraction plus retinoscopy. That is, refraction is an equally important part, and for all children, just like pediatric ophthalmologists, retinoscopy becomes important. I do retinoscopy even for my refractive surgery, SMILE, LASIK patients, because that becomes an important part of detecting from fruste keratoconus. Topography and tomography, probably indispensable in the present modality of treatments, because we can invariably pick them up very, very early. The treatment paradigm is basically the goal, approach, and the options. The goal is stabilization of keratoconus to prevent changes in the shape. The approach is, as I said, based on disease severity, and I'll show you an algorithm that we follow, and we try and customize it to individual needs. When we're looking at collagen cross-linking, probably the most commonly performed procedure, aim is basically to increase the corneal rigidity. The effectivity is actually very good. In pediatric patients, almost about 90% of them have stability of the keratoconus, and it is generally well tolerated in all patients. Very occasionally, if the allergies are not controlled, they tend to be symptomatic and tend to move around during the collagen cross-linking. Most of them, we are able to, at least up to 9 years and above, we are able to do it under local anesthesia with very, very mild sedation. And as I said, that it does stabilize the keratoconus quite good. Usually, the average reduction is about a couple of diopters, and effectivity, as I said, is about 80%. The important point is about yearly follow-up. A lot of them may require, 20% of them may require a second treatment. We have done it in about 2 patients on progression, which occurred almost up to 6 years. So the patient was operated at 10 years, and at 16, we needed to repeat the collagen cross-linking. There are some advanced collagen cross-linking techniques which come under accelerated protocol, which is what we use normally, which is 9 milliwatts for about 10 minutes, and that gives the stability the best, based on current literature as well. Some customized protocols are there wherein you treat only the area of the ectasia. Most of them, the reduction in Kmax is about 1 to 3 diopters. There are some riboflavin options in collagen cross-linking, which is transepithelial, though there is some long-term data saying it may be not as effective as epithelial off, but in some centers, this seems to be a preferred option purely because of the patient comfort. Scleral lenses in keratoconus, an important part for visual rehabilitation. Almost all of them have an improvement in the best corrected vision. Patient satisfaction is almost about 90%, and most of them, once they are taught, are able to do it themselves. The important part is that even for slightly advanced cones or patients not willing for immediate treatment, the collagen cross-linking fit is actually very, very good. The BCA improvement is invariably in about 85%. Very occasionally, we need to do some additional intervention to improve the fit, but majority of the time, they have very, very successful adaptation. Intracorneal ring segments, probably more recent addition. Not my primary procedure for collagen cross-linking, but that is a reduction in the Kmax, usually up to early to moderate keratoconus. We suggest this. A lot of them have an improvement of uncorrected and best corrected vision. A small risk of segment extrusion tends to be there in about 5%. In the follow-up of patients, usually the uncorrected and the best corrected improves by about 70%, and the reduction is slightly more than collagen cross-linking. So you may get a synergistic effect if you plan that with collagen cross-linking. Topo-guided PRK, slightly controversial when you're looking at pediatric, but very well accepted for adults. And the response is slightly less than collagen cross-linking or when you're doing it with intracorneal rings, partly because you cannot ablate a lot. You have a restriction of about 20 to 30 microns. But about 70% of them do show visual improvement. Clinical outcomes probably is good, but what is something troubling, especially in children, is sometimes the corneal haze, but the stability is very good. Most of them will require a secondary optical aid, either a good spectacle fit or scleral lenses. Phakic lenses, also something, some of them not the most common way of approaching visual rehabilitation, but almost a very rapid reduction in the amount of sphere and the cylinder. So if you have large refractive errors with stable keratoconus, the youngest we have done is about 16 years, but there is a significant improvement both in uncorrected and definitely the best corrected vision. What is important in phakic IOL calculation is probably in some of them there may be a myopic shift. The second part is the sulcus to sulcus measurement, which is important because some of them you would have to get a very good refractive calculation to be done, and we aim for a bit of myopia, usually about -1 in phakic IOLs. Lamellar keratoplasty techniques was something that we were offering a lot more. The amount of surgery that we're doing is come down significantly. But graft survival in children is almost about 90%. I would not touch upon this, but long-term outcomes of LK are very, very good. Vision therapy is something we started doing for pediatric keratoconus. We found that there is an improvement in some of these patients if they're selected well, especially if there is a chance of amblyopia. We are still in very, very early stages of vision therapy, but now our approach is combining treatments, and that we find is probably the best way of doing that. Some mention of iontophoresis. I know it's quite popular in Europe. I don't have any personal experience. So now the approach is genetic profiling, tailored treatment as per the stage of the keratoconus, and usually you get very good outcomes, almost 85% improvement. I mentioned about family counseling partly because of the results, and I will touch with my last slide about the broad outcomes. So when we look at early and advanced keratoconus, the approach is based on the stage of the treatment, and I'll be very happy to share this if anybody is interested. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Anand, for an excellent talk. Do you recommend phakic IOLs in children?
So as I said, it's not my first preferred option, but in stable keratoconus beyond 16, in case of advanced refractive errors where the significance of myopia and astigmatism is very, very significant, we have done about 2 patients. But as I said, not my primary procedure. If you're looking at younger patients, probably not.
What is the youngest age of the youngest child you have done collagen cross-linking?
7.
So that is under general anesthetic?
Yes. So anything, as I said, my cutoff is 9 to 10. You can make out during examination itself. If it's a cooperative 9, 10-year-old with a bit of speech, occasionally I do get one of the patient relatives in the OT, so they're speaking and holding the hand. That really helps.
Any questions to Dr. Anand? Anyone from audience? If there are no questions, then thank you, Dr. Anand.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Tariq Qureshi, he will be speaking on role of vitrectomy in ocular trauma in pediatric cases. Dr. Qureshi, please.
Good afternoon. respected chairman, co-chairman, and delegates. I'll be shortly speaking on role of vitrectomy in pediatric ocular trauma. Today's child is tomorrow's future. So 2.4 million eye injuries occur worldwide, out of which 35% occur below 14 years of age. 60% of the pediatric injuries occur during sports or recreational events. Prevalence of ocular injuries is more in male children. Eye injuries are leading cause of visual disability and blindness in children. It's a preventable cause of visual impairment. 90% of the injuries can be treated or decrease in severity with timely diagnosis and treatment. Vitrectomy has an important role in the management of pediatric ocular trauma. It prevents morbidity and mortality in perforating and penetrating injuries. Indications of vitrectomy. Penetrating injury with vitreous in anterior chamber on the wound, thus preventing epithelial ingrowth or fibrous ingrowth, dislocated lens, vitreous hemorrhage, retinal detachment, retinal intraocular foreign body, endophthalmitis, and perforating injury. Now, the question comes when to do vitrectomy. If it's the vitreous hemorrhage, one can wait for 2 to 6 weeks, but it's retained intraocular foreign body, immediate surgery, endophthalmitis, immediate surgery, perforating and penetrating injury, immediate surgery. Advantage is that present-day 27-gauge vitrectomy offers wide array of advantages, which is it's transconjunctival, so no suturing is required, no corneal distortion or no astigmatism, maintains intraocular pressure per op, reduce operation time, thus reducing the inflammation and complications. The role of vitrectomy in ocular trauma is immense and ensures good visual recovery. Key to success is early intervention. Results of surgery are rewarding. And this is a short video. This is a case of injury with a retained foreign body. The primary repair was done somewhere else, and the patient was referred for vitrectomy. After clearing the vitreous, we have found an intraocular foreign body in the subretinal space. We are trying to make a retinotomy there to dislodge the foreign body into the vitreous cavity and clearing the vitreous around the foreign body and removing the foreign body thereafter. And such a case needs an intervention, and we cannot wait for a week or so, and early improvement of the vision is guaranteed. This is another case of perforating injury wherein the vitrectomy was delayed, and you can see the thick membranes in the vitreous as if you are cutting the cloth. It's very difficult to operate such as already in children the vitreous is quite gel, and induction of PVD in children is very difficult. And now you can see the part of the retina is visible, and now you will see the exit wound. Exit wound has formed a thick scar, and if we don't remove this scar, it's going to cause a tractional retinal detachment or a giant retinal tear. You can see we're going around the margins of the wound, and this scar has to be removed, and we have planned a retinochoroidectomy with fluid exchange, endolaser, and siliconoid. Fortunately, the exit wound was in the nasal side of the retina, and patient was fortunate enough to have a vision of 6/12. We are trying to remove the scar, but we had a lot of difficulty as the scar was very, very thick. But we finally managed to remove the scar piecemeal and achieve the retinochoroidectomy. We have removed the central part, and now we are trying to remove it en masse. We tried to pull it, but it's so adherent to the retina and it may cause a total detachment. So at this stage, one should have a patience and remove it by piecemeals till it is removed completely and chopped off. And at the end, you can see this whole scar is removed and the retinal choroidectomy is achieved, and retina is finally settled with endolaser. These are the cases where the intervention in pediatric ophthalmology is very, very important, and interventional surgeries have to be done at the earliest. And in such a case, if it's not treated as it was done, this surgery would have lasted, say, maximum of 30 minutes and lasted around 1.5 hours. And you can see with piecemeal how difficult is this to remove the scars. And once we removed it, everything was perfect and retina got settled. This is the last stage where we removed the whole scar and achieved retinochoroidectomy and then induced fluid air exchange and then endolaser and silicone oil. This is the final picture, and the scar is completely removed. And this is the final story. Then there was another case of a vitreous hemorrhage, and wherein the vitreous hemorrhage was quite thick, and for 6 weeks it didn't resolve. We planned to do vitrectomy, and as I said earlier, that vitrectomy in a child is not that easy in an adult. Firstly, the vitreous is quite thick gel. Induction of PVD is very difficult, and once we induce PVD, one has to be very, very careful of not touching the lens, because the size of eyes in the pediatric age is smaller than what we expect, and in such cases we have to be absolute meticulous and do all the procedures of core vitrectomy, induction of PVD, peripheral cleaning, indentation, and the key to success is that even the last bit of vitreous has to be removed. This was another case of foreign body with a hole near the disc, and we have been able to remove it completely. Thank you all for your patient hearing.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation and nice videos. So as a pediatric ophthalmologists, we are always worried about amblyopia, vitreous hemorrhage causing amblyopia. So how soon do you want to do vitrectomy in case of dense VH without any other globe injury or lens subluxation or RD?
Sir, as I said, that few situations demand early vitrectomy, like if it's a retinal detachment, intraocular foreign body, retained intraocular foreign body, or endophthalmites. Endophthalmites in children is nowadays prevalent because of these hypodermic needle injuries, and in such cases, the early vitrectomy. Amblyopia in every pediatric surgery is treatment of amblyopia in every pediatric surgery is key to success. Whether you have done an IOL, you have done a squint surgery, or you have done a retinal surgery, post-operative treatment is more important than the surgical intervention. So they have to be followed frequently and treated accordingly. Thank you.
Any questions from the audience? We can allow one question.
Yes, Dr. Kochari, I'm a resident from Rome University. I wanted to ask, in the case of the advanced scarring, is it possible, or do you think you could use like a fibrinolytic for helping with the scar removal tissue?
You have seen that even with a cutter, it was very difficult to remove. How can a thick scar be removed by a fibrinolytic agent? And even with this cutting rate of around 20,000 per minute, it was very, very difficult, and it was a time-consuming procedure. I don't think, in my opinion, the fibrinolytic in a thick scar will be effective.
But using it beforehand, would it
No, I have never
to
used such agents in my life.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tariq Qureshi, for your excellent talk. So the next talk will be by Professor Karanjit Singh. I will talk about refractive lens exchange in anisometropic amblyopia.
Actually, my talk was at 8 o'clock in the morning. And before my talk, there was one talk by a stalwart and strabismologist. She discussed about esotropia and LASIK procedures and in young children. Go to 8 o'clock slot, and there you might get my talk.
Professor Kamaljit will take the next talk and then take you in the immediately after.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So I invite my co-chair, Dr. Hiranya Abhisekara, consultant pediatric ophthalmologist at the Lady Ridgeway Hospital for Children, to give us an update on retinoblastoma.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Amila, for inviting me to do this talk. Sincerely, I forgot to send my CV to the organizers, so I'm just displaying a few sentences on my CV. So I was trained in Birmingham, and I've been managing retinoblastoma, and I have contributed a little bit to the science as well. So retinoblastoma is the most common ocular malignancy in children. It is lethal if you leave it untreated. In Western world, in high-income countries, the outcome is really fantastic with 100% disease-free survival rate over 10 years. But depending on the economic stage of the country, the outcome depends. As far as health indices are concerned, Sri Lanka is a little bit outlining. So, like our maternal mortality, childhood mortality, the mortality from retinoblastoma also different from rest of our colleagues in low, middle-income countries. So, first, before managing, you need a proper diagnosis, and you have to classify the disease. So, diagnosis and classification of retinoblastoma is mainly clinical. So you see this odd wide reflex or this unusual squint, and you dilate the kid to see the one of these tumors on the posterior pole. The next thing you would do is get your B-scan probe and do an ultrasound scan. You may do this while you are doing the EUA, but you can do conveniently in the clinic as well. And demonstrate this retrolental mass with or without RD, and you will see this calcification in the lesion, which is almost diagnostic. So you need EUA for accurate classification, and you need to look at the other eye, make sure it's a bilateral disease or unilateral disease, and if there are any tumors in the other eye, group A tumors particularly we find, we can do laser. And we can document with retinal photography. So international classification of retinoblastoma is the current classification system in the practice. Group A, small tumors away from disc and macula. Group B are bigger tumors closer to disc or macula, may have a cuff of SRF without vitreous seeds. Group C, isolated vitreous seeds with a cuff of SRF and a bigger tumor. Group D is diffuse seeds, and the stage, the group increases, the prognosis becomes poorer. Group E is the poorest one, as far as the intraocular disease is concerned, and it's extensive tumor. So, enucleation is a fantastic management option. Perhaps it's the oldest managing modality of retinoblastoma. It cures in most cases, particularly in unilateral group E diseases. If a patient doesn't need further chemotherapy or any other therapy once proper enucleation is done. But our mainstay of treatment is thermochemotherapy. That includes chemotherapy plus focal therapy with laser or cryo. Intraarterial chemotherapy has risen over the last decade as primary treatment and as well as the second salvage treatment for certain selected cases. Intravitreal, intracameral chemotherapy are very good modalities of globe salvage treatment. And there are plaque and brachytherapy, which I don't have experience in these techniques. Intravenous chemotherapy is our primary therapy. And in most parts of the world, this is the primary therapy. So this includes 6 cycles of chemotherapy, 3 agents. In institutions where intraarterial chemotherapy is available, they have separate indications to start intravenous chemotherapy. But in our setup, we start intravenous chemotherapy in all patients who require chemotherapy. So long-term outcome is very good. Of course, we never use intravenous chemotherapy as the sole therapy. It is combined with other therapies. So focal therapy is basically is to consolidate the tumor, which is reduced by the chemotherapy. Cryotherapy and transpupillary thermotherapy are excellent ways of giving focal therapy. So cryotherapy is performed under indirect ophthalmoscopy. So we can place the probe either on the conjunctiva, or we can make a nip on the conjunctiva and place the probe on the sclera directly for more posterior tumors. And we have to follow the triple freeze thaw technique. Thermotherapy is by 810 nanometer diode laser on continuous mode, which is an excellent way of treating these patients. And in difficult cases, ICG can be used, although I have no experience in using ICG. Intraarterial chemotherapy, as I said earlier, has become a mainstay of treatment for selected cases in retinoblastoma, but still remains away from our systems. So it involves delivering chemotherapy directly onto the orifice of the ophthalmic artery, which is very successful in selected cases. So first line therapy in particularly unilateral disease, and salvage therapy once the primary therapy is failed. So a lot of my friends ask why IAC is not available in Sri Lanka. Of course, Dr. Santosh Honavar, the editor of Indian Journal of Ophthalmology, has given the answer. So we have economic barriers that we cannot go through. So that's the main reason why we are not having intraarterial chemotherapy. Not that expertise, not the ability to do these things, but the sustainability of maintaining this modality of treatment is very, very difficult in our setup. Intravitreal chemotherapy is used, is basically a very safe way of injecting melphalan and topotecan into the vitreous without refluxing. And it's a main globe salvage treatment in our setup, and it's being standard throughout the world. So precision intravitreal chemotherapy is upcoming. And it involves delivering the chemotherapy directly onto the accurate place where it requires through intravitreal injection. So in selected cases, we can do intracameral chemotherapy, but we have to remember intravitreal or intracameral chemotherapy are never used as primary chemotherapy. So these are globe salvage, secondary treatments. So this is a summary of amalgamation of all the treatment modalities. First, we have to establish the diagnosis. Once the diagnosis is made, we have to decide whether to go for chemotherapy or whether to do enucleation. So enucleation is a very excellent, it's a great way of treating certain selected patients. So it saves lives. In centers where IAC, intraarterial chemotherapy is available, so you can use for group C, D, E, unilateral, non-germline cases very successfully. But bilateral cases almost always require intravenous chemotherapy. So remember, retinoblastoma management is not one man's job, it's a teamwork. If one fails, the whole system fails. So to give the life expectancy and globe salvage to these kids, we need this team going on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Irania. Any questions from the audience? Dr. Irania, how you mentioned Sri Lanka rates as 93%?
Yes, sir.
Of salvaging the globe?
No, life expectancy.
Life expectancy, okay. So in your hands, enucleation is still the most widely practiced, and
yes,
as an adjuvant, you give any of the other therapies that you're talking about?
Sorry, question is?
For tumors which are greater than grade 2, enucleation would still be the primary.
No, enucleation I would do in group B cases, particularly if it is unilateral. I would not think about any other treatment. But if it is bilateral, then I would go for the intravenous chemotherapy and then decide on enucleation later on, because I do not want to delay the proper treatment for the child.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll now have Professor Kamaljit Singh on refractive lens exchange in anisometropic amblyopia.
Thank you, Dr. Maskati, Dr. Dadia, and Sao Posa, and Sri Lanka ophthalmologists for giving me this opportunity. Amblyopia, you see, is a big problem in our hand, and presentation of amblyopia is many a times delayed in India. People don't worry about getting their examination done, and when the examination is done, they find that in one eye they have amblyopia. So that is a big problem. Then there are studies in which for amblyopia phakic IOLs have been tried, and the results have been very good. So refractive surgery for amblyopia continues, and many people do LASIK, and you had seen in the morning that Madam was talking about doing LASIK and other procedures for treating the esotropia, accommodative esotropia that was there. So now there could be a myopic and isometropic amblyopia in many cases, and at the age of 25 years, 50 years, I have seen that people having an isometropia and they were not even aware of that. One of them is my school friend who used to come to my house every day, and still he'd never bothered to get his vision checked. And at 50 years he called me, and I came to know that he had amblyopia, an isometropic myopic amblyopia. So that sort of situation is there. So what to do at this stage? You can do a refractive correction, you can give them glasses. You can do patching also even in adult amblyopia, and penalization pharmacological therapy, but none of them usually work. So this was my first case in 2009, where I found that this patient had minus 9.5 diopter of spherical error with this little bit of cylinder, and a divergent squint also in that eye. So I asked him, why have you never used contact lenses or glasses? He said that I can't afford the contact lenses. Every time they need to be changed. And the phakic IOLs he never bothered about, so he could not afford even that. So that was my first case where I did my refractive lens exchange. And to my surprise, the best corrected vision was 618 before surgery, though the squint was there, and the other eye was normal. So when I did the refractive lens exchange, I found that the vision improved to 6.9, and that means that there was no anisometropic amblyopia. Little bit of strabismus was there. Still the patient's vision improved at the age of 38 years. This is another case where the refractive error was there. Anisometropia to the tune of minus 11.5 diopters was there, and we did a refractive lens exchange, and these options were there, but the affordability is very poor, so we do refractive lens exchange. Plus in adults, even in myopia, the refractive lens is advocated. So the RLE can be done in all these cases, and the results are very good. And in myopia, usually the amblyopia is not very dense even at this age. I came to know then only. And if you give them glasses, the minification occurs, so the vision remains poor, even with the best corrected glasses, so that can be done. And we have done about 30 cases, and in most of them we have found that the results are very, very good. So this is how we... This is in refractive lens exchange, what we do is we make slightly larger capsular axis, and this lens is taken out of the bag, and then simply phacoaspiration is done. Take care that you don't do too much of surge in them, so that too much of movement of the vitreous is not there and chances of detachments are reduced. So it has been already said by various authors and by Professor Prem Prakash, the authority in India, that usually occurrence of amblyopia in myopia is not common, because these patients, even when not corrected, have the opportunity of having adequate stimulus for development of vision from near objects. So the amblyopia is not that dense, and if you do the surgery, refractive correction plus strabismus correction, patient gets very good vision and very good outcome. So these are some of the cases which were done by Professor Prem Prakash and found that the results were very good. And it was in the year 1983 that he told that the amblyopia is not dense. So this is how you can do the job there. And therefore, in conclusion, we can say that refractive lens exchange with IOL implantation in amblyopia with manifest squint has the advantage of providing cheaper and most stable refractive procedure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Kamaljeet. And any questions from the audience? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
We now invite Dr. Rameshri Shastri, consultant ophthalmologist and glaucoma specialist from Hyderabad, talk to us about recent advances in management of pediatric glaucoma.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to thank Dr. Qureshi, the organizing committee of SAOPOSA, and Professor Dadeya for giving me this opportunity. Today I will be speaking about the recent advances in pediatric glaucoma. It's a heterogeneous array of diseases with ocular dysgenesis and causing raised intraocular pressure that can cause blindness to the percent of 4.2 to 5% in pediatric population. Study in South India have shown it is in 1 to 3,300 population, bilateral in 70% of the cases having asymmetric disease and a male predilection. We know about the classical triad of congenital glaucoma, but there are certain signs which are very subtle, like dilatation of the upper eyelid veins, anterior embryotoxon, and peripheral iris degeneration that can make things complicated. Molecular etiology of PCG is not yet fully understood. However, the recent advances in genomics have shown us multiple genes that are involved, and the most common is CYP1B1 and LTPP2. CYP1 gene mutations have been seen as sequence variations and missense mutations, and in Spain, 30% of the cases have shown loss of these function in CYP1B1 variants, leading to null genotypes. So those cases with CYP1B1 have known to have early onset disease with severe manifestations, and post-operatively have more post-operative haze and very bad prognosis. LTPP2 mutations are also known to have causation factor in PCG. They have frame shift mutations most commonly noted. Currently identified genes explain to about only 5 to 50% of the cases that have been identified. Coming to recent advances, the IOP measurement in children is quite challenging and technically difficult. Most of them require examination and anesthesia. The tonometry options we have a Schiot's tonometer, Perkins, TonoPen, and the iCare Pro and iCare tonometers. Schiot's tonometry is not being used here because of decreased scleral rigidity. Perkins and is the gold standard, which is the handheld version of the Goldman applanation tonometer. It is the preferred method. We have several studies that have compared TonoPen with Goldman applanation tonometry. It tends to overestimate intraocular pressure. Any IOP more than 16, average of 3 readings has to be taken. That's the preferred practice pattern. Coming to rebound tonometry, we have iCare and the iCare Pro. The iCare Pro can be used in supine position, especially in examination and anesthesia. There are variable limits of agreement, as you see in this table. However, when we have an IOP more than 19 millimeters of mercury, it's better to confirm it with the Perkins tonometer with the child under anesthesia. Coming to other investigations, the innovations in anterior segment OCT. Now, this is the picture on the right side that you see, on the extreme left that you see is a normal child with the right eye, whereas the left eye shows absent Schlemm's canal and a hyperreflective membrane on the trabecular area. This is another picture of an intraoperative anterior segment OCT which shows absent Schlemm's canal. This is another eye with patent Schlemm's canal. And this is the picture of the anterior segment OCT showing the HAPS ray as a hyperreflective membrane which is floating in the anterior chamber. The bottom 2 pictures show hyperreflective membrane of varying densities. So anterior segment OCT helps us understand the varying morphological abnormalities and help us identify the appropriate surgical modality that we can incorporate in treating them. UBM acts as a in vivo histopathology. A study done by Tandon et al. Have shown that those cases with pediatric glaucoma have smaller Schlemm's canal compared to the healthy counterparts. This is the quantitative ultrasound biomicroscopy where we can measure the various parameters as mentioned here, angle to angle, CCT, radius of curvature, and the anterior chamber depth. With the help of Python iMark, that is a semi-automated assessment using UBM, we can mark all these 8 points, and all these can be used, the images can be taken by the technician, and they can be used for telemedicine and research purposes. Posterior segment OCT helps us in understanding the retinal nerve fiber layer, and especially in these eyes with PCG, which are tending to have axial elongation and high myopia. But we need to understand the different developmental trajectories of the different retinal layers, and you see that the development or identification of an ellipsoid zone indicates retinal maturity. This is, there's a picture in the center is the picture of an eye with primary congenital glaucoma showing a deep posterior nerve head cup and an absent ellipsoid zone. This is compared to the right eye and the healthy control with the help of handheld OCT. RETCAM is another important investigative modality for both anterior and posterior segment images. The current trends coming to in surgical management, this is the goniotomy that we have and the combined trabeculotomy, trabeculectomy. However, there are certain variations in these conventional surgeries. So once we identify the Schlemm's canal, which is a gutter-shaped position landmark between the blue and the white junction, an incision which is deeper, and you can see an ooze and the fluid coming out of that. So variations are using viscotrabeculotomy. I'm sorry for that spelling. 23 gauge cannula is inserted into it, and a high molecular weight visco is injected into the Schlemm's canal. The other variation is cannulation using a 5-0-proline, that is an ab externo procedure. Another important procedure that has come up now is the impact technique using an illuminated microcatheter where a fiber optic wire is inserted into the Schlemm's canal, and the entire path of the Schlemm's canal that is dilated with the help of this fiber optic probe can be identified, and then once it comes out at the other end, it can be pulled to break the inner wall. Gonioscopy-assisted transluminal trabeculotomy is another where we identify the anterior border of the posterior trabecular meshwork, incise for about 2 to 3 clock hours, and the bulbous end of the proline, heat cauterized proline, is inserted through the incision, and it passes 360 degrees. And once it is retrieved at the other end, both ends are pulled out to cut open the inner wall of the Schlemm's canal 360 degrees. Micro-incisional trabeculectomy is another surgery that has been popularized by Dr. Aparna, who is my mentor. She identified the posterior trabecular meshwork here, and the vertical cuts are made at 2 to 4 clock hours, and the trabecular tissue between the two landmark cuts is peeled off using a vitrectomy forceps. So here the entire trabecular tissue can be got for research purposes, and we have studied the histopathology of this trabecular tissue. So TSCPC has been used as a conventional surgery for refractory glaucomas. The novel type is the micropulse diode laser, which has less complications and high success rate. Endocyclophotocoagulation is another cyclodestructive procedure, which is an intraocular procedure. Here we use a probe with light and laser delivery system in a single probe, and the pars plana area is inflated with the high molecular weight visco after a cataract surgery. And the ciliary processes are ablated with the help of laser. The endpoint is just the ablation of cyclodestructive. There are various pharmacological therapies, and netarsudil, which is a Rho kinase inhibitor, has been the newer additive in the armamentarium. Gene therapy is involving introduction and removal of altered genetic material into the cells. This have come from the last 15 years, but the last few years there have been viral and non-viral vector gene delivery systems that have targeted the particular target sites, and there are several studies that have come up. And the key limitation here is these cannot reach the target cells of the fetus. Plus, developing a relevant pharmacological drug target with excellent pharmacological benefit and low off-target side effect is quite challenging. So the future direction is using a personalized medicine with advanced imaging technologies and the futuristic mix, that is the future of glaucoma therapy, along with a robotic-assisted surgery, genes and cell therapies, and using artificial imaging and predictive analytics and telemedicine is the way forward in treating glaucoma. And early diagnosis is quite crucial with visual rehabilitation in achieving better outcome in such eyes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shastri. What is, in your experience now, about what percentage of cases would you still do the traditional trabeculectomy with trabeculotomy with the Professor Ham spatula? Yeah.
I've done 70% of my cases now. I still do a conventional surgery, but the newer surgical techniques have been still evolving.
Okay.
So I've done a few of congenital glaucomas with MIT, that is the microincisional trabeculectomy. The results are good.
But 70% still remains
Yes,
gold
yes,
standard.
yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are no other questions. I invite Dr. Usha Johari to talk about the Global Vision Brain Alliance for CVI, visual impairment. She is a consultant ophthalmologist at the Hiranandani Hospital at Mumbai.
A very good afternoon to all of you, and special thanks to the local organizer of Dr. Quresh Maskati and Dr. Dadia for giving me this opportunity. So, the eye problems in developmental disability is not very commonly looked by the ophthalmologist. What to look for, what to do, and when to follow up is a big question mark. And I've just started this work a few years back. And you'll all agree with me that the pediatric eye care services are not adequate in our country, most probably because they're neglected, they're missed out, and they're ignored. So the poet says eye is a window to soul, but in my opinion, the eye is a portal to brain, and it's also a tail and the window to the brain. The visual connectivity and the brain connectivity are so intricately connected that it is surprising to know that the 60% of the human brain is related to visual acuity, and 40% of the brain for processing and supporting vision, which was mentioned by Nakoyama way back in 2012. So the vision loss is not just brain related, but it's not just eye related, but it's also brain related. So our aim here is to reach out, medical and the paramedical professionals, provide training in use using simple methods, and have a network of vision professionals. So the facts, you'll all agree with me, that 80% of the all learning takes place in the first 12 years of life, and only 1/3 of the children go to get an eye examination done in the school, and 60% of the students have learning difficulties which have undetected vision problems, and 1 in 4 school-age children have vision problems. So our objective here is to detect the ocular anomaly, record the visual capacity, treat the visual problems which are neglected, and overcome the visual handicap in time, and facilitate overall rehabilitation and development, and not to say nothing can be done. So it is surprising to know that the visual disorders are number 1 in childhood disability, and mentally and disabled children are twice likely to have vision problems. So how early can we detect these eye problems? We all know, as an ophthalmologist, the eye fixation takes place at 3 months of age, binocular single vision fusion and stereopsis at 7 years of age. Visual system in infant is, of course, very dynamic and sensitive, and we have classified them into reversible, partially reversible, and irreversible, which partially and reversible are almost 100% correctable. Now let's look into the irreversible problems where our friends visual rehabilitation people play a very important role. It's because we detect this at a very, very late stage of life. Incidence of visual loss in developmental disability. Peter Black carried out a study where 80% of the children had eye problems, only 20 were normal. But see our statistics, where we carried out a study on 159 children, and 91% of these children had eye problems. So the question here is, can this be incidental? No. And another interesting thing that we noticed was many children had multiple eye problems. It was not just one eye problem. So the question again comes here is, can we make a difference to the lives of these many children and families and maximize their visual potential? It's so simple. Spectacle therapy. Imagine a child having impaired mobility, impaired communication, and over and above that has an impaired vision. These children could be requested by the parents, could be requested to wear the glasses. And of course, there is a best visual outcome if the glasses are worn early. And why will the child not wear the glasses if the child can perceive things around the world, around the child easily? Refractive cycle. Hyperopia, which normally reduces in a child, is retained in a child with cerebral palsy. Astigmatism is also retained. And one other interesting thing is the accommodative disorders, which normally at the age of 40, it appears in a child at the age of, at the childhood age. Accommodation disorders, as we all know, is not just within the eye, it is beyond the eye. and a special attention has to be drawn towards accommodative disorders. So these children have inability to sustain the accurate focus, and they do need reading glasses. Strabismus, the studies which were carried out found that in the normal population, only 3% of the children had strabismus, whereas in cerebral palsy, 46% of the children had strabismus. It was not just because of the muscles in the eye, it was because of the lesions in the subcortical, oculomotor, and the cerebellar area. And the severity was proportionate to the cortical visual impairment. And it's not always due to refractive error or the muscle imbalance. Look at the slide with an eye and the postural abnormalities. Even these children have eye problems because of the retrochiasmatic damage of the visual system. Irreversible problems, which is very close to my work which I'm carrying out. Cortical visual impairment, which is where our visual rehabilitation plays a role. We as ophthalmologists have a very limited knowledge about this. So the vision involved and the processing involved are the two aspects. With the occipital lobe, we mainly focus on the occipital lobe, which is between the eye and the occipital lobe, which takes the messages, which is an input system, but we always tend to forget the processing which is involved, where we have the occipital assessed areas like the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe. So in a child with cortical visual impairment, the eyes are normal, the vision has fallen down, all the ocular findings are normal, because there is a lesion in the lateral beyond lateral geniculate body and at the lateral geniculate body up to the visual cortex. So the CVI is not a new entity. It was introduced way back in 1990, and this is a small functional vision map which shows the roots as the two eyes, the visual pathway which is between the trunk to the occipital lobe, the dorsal and the ventral system with the two branches, and the clusters of visual difficulties which are the branches of the tree. So basically there's a breakdown between the eye and the brain. Now the causes of CVI are many. Let's not go into the depth of it. But as I explained to you, it's a damage or the malfunction of the visual pathway and lateral geniculate body, including the optic radiations, occipital cortex, and the visual associated areas. So the dorsal stream, which is the posterior lobe, basically when it helps us to locate the components in the visual scene and gives attention to it, and especially the inferior field is affected when the dorsal stream is affected, and it also helps in visual guidance, whereas the ventral stream, which is at the temporal lobe, the blue area, helps in recognizing the face, shapes, letters, and the alphabets. So the visual part of the visual brain is basically two parts, the dorsal stream and the ventral stream. So in the dorsal stream, when there is a damage, there is a difficulty in getting around, like using the stairs, sidewalks, reaching forward or grabbing a drink. So it helps, when there's a damage to the dorsal system, there's a difficulty in moving in the space. And when there's a damage to the ventral system, there's a difficulty in recognizing face, objects, and places. Now the frontal cortex, which is a light orange area, it allows planning. The frontal area field create an eye and hand movement to look at the head movement, to look at the motor cortex, and thus the motor cortex helps the body to move with the response. This is a very important wiring system where I have mentioned that the occipital cortex helps in seeing, frontal cortex helps in thinking, dorsal and the ventral stream helps in processing, and it is connected with the frontal lobe, which helps us to create an action. This is the importance of CVI. So these are the few symptoms of CVI. They have difficulty in remembering things, imagining things. They have difficulty in fast movements, using vision to move the parts of the body, recognizing objects, eyes getting tired, visual loss, and so on. These are few articles that are published. So in my opinion, it's not just the role of an ophthalmologist, it's a multidisciplinary specialties where we could proudly say that we alone cannot do anything. We require these specialists, and the questions to be answered is, can CP be detected in pregnancy? Maybe, may not be. So let's not tell our children that nothing can be done. Let us suspect, detect, and diagnose at an early age, catch them young and catch them at a very early stage. So the take-home message is awareness of visual ability, disability is nil. Awareness to the associated ocular problem in developmental disability with help of visual rehabilitation will go a long way for a better quality of vision. And awareness is like a sun. When it shines on the things, maybe they're transformed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Usha, for throwing a lot of light on something which most ophthalmologists themselves are not very aware of, and putting it in the spotlight and highlighting the fact that we need a huge team approach to tackle these difficult children. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Any questions from the audience? We can allow one question. Thank you very much for your excellent talk. And we'll move on to the next talk. The next talk will be delivered by Dr. Rajat Mohan Srivastava. We'll talk about screening visual and ocular disabilities.
Namaskar. At the outset, I would like to thank the College of Ophthalmologists of Sri Lanka, Kureti sir and Dadia sir, for giving me this opportunity to present my talk here. And I would like to extend my greetings to the society for a grand success of this conference. I think listening to the previous few talks, this topic becomes even more pertinent. And what I'm going to discuss in my talk is that I'll be going through some of the common methods which we use for screening these children. And what we want to assess is to come up with an appropriate method for these children. I do not have any financial disclosures. So we already understand that visual impairment and amblyopia are pressing concerns. And often what we realize is that the underlying problem is sometimes an uncorrected refractive error which goes undiagnosed. And this is more so, as ma'am just said, in children with neurological disabilities, they are even more underdiagnosed. So what it leads to is that not only compromises the quality of life in these children, but it adds to the socioeconomic burden of the society. So what do we need to do? A simple approach is to just perform a good and appropriate timely screening of these children and maybe prevent severe visual impairment or amblyopia in these children. So how do we go about this screening? When should we screen these children? One of the earliest time, I think the screening must start as early as at the time of birth, that the child should be screened by an ophthalmologist. And thereafter, whenever the children visit for their immunization visit or go for a school entrance, they should undergo a screening. If it is feasible, I would recommend a periodic screening in school or in community so that we can pick up these children as early as possible. What I believe is that a pediatrician's clinic provides a very apt space where if you can perform opportunistic screening of these children, we may be able to pick up even more children who are at risk of developing amblyopia or severe visual impairment. Now, what do we need to actually screen for is simply any significant refractive error in the eye or any media opacity, or if we can pick up any misalignment of the visual axis in these children. So how do we go about it? Screening can basically be classified into two main categories: the traditional method, where we use the visual acuity assessment, or the device-based method. Now, with the upcoming of the devices, it has really changed the landscape of screening children. Traditional visual screening is by far the most commonly used and is cost-effective method of screening children. It can be performed in various settings, right from our clinics to classrooms to even community centers. So that adds to the versatility of this technique. But what do we often see is that when we screen children using the traditional method of visual acuity assessment, they are not very reliable. The inherent subjectivity of the responses and of the examiner, it is often difficult to actually know how much is the visual disability in this child. And getting a good assessment of what the visual acuity in a young children is actually difficult in these children. So that, and we know that our primary target is to assess these children. So if we are not able to assess them correctly, then it totally undermines the practical approach of this kind of screening method. So we have devices. Now, just to put a brief thing, we have two major type of devices. One of them is a photo screener. What it basically does is that it takes images of both the eyes and captures the red glow images and analyzes the Bruckner reflex characteristic. And on the basis of the algorithm, when it tries to analyze these red images, it tells whether the child is at risk for developing amblyopia or not, and then it screens. And what our autorefractor actually does is just it just objectively assesses the refractive error in these children and tells us whether it requires further treatment or not. But you see, the main advantage of these techniques when it compares to the traditional method is that they are very objective in their assessment. So it circumvents the subjectivity which is involved in the traditional method of examination. Not only are they quick, but they also provide us with objective, useful information which increases the quality of our screening. But in spite of all these advantages, the pasture is not completely green here either. One of the major drawbacks when using device-based screening method is the cost and the availability of these devices. And at the same time, we must remember that these technologies are still developing. So what happens that the result which you may obtain from one particular device may vary from the other one, and that would add to the confusion. So you may not have a complete idea about what the problem is, even with the help of these devices. Now what we see is that apart from these devices, smartphone use is actually coming, it is a very unique and upcoming way of screening these children. Smartphones are ubiquitous by nature and are very easy to use. And that makes them an ideal screening devices. In fact, one of the studies which we performed was that we captured the red glow using these smartphones in school children, and we compared the outcome of screening with the traditional method of screening. And what we realized that when we assess the red glow remotely in our colleges, we could do a better screening compared to the traditional method of screening. So that was very encouraging for us. And now we have app-based screening methods, like you have got the Go Check Kids app or even the Apollo Infant Sight app. These apps are upcoming, and they, I'm sure, will help in further improving the screening of these children using the smartphones. So that shows that devices, the use of devices is going to come up more and more for screening these children. So does that mean that device-based screening is actually superior to the traditional method of screening? Well, the jury is still out. What we can say clearly at this point of time is the device-based screening method is recommended in pre-verbal children, and that too in the developed world, where you have some insurance support to bear the cost. We have also seen that, especially some studies in India, it shows that if you have got children with neurological disabilities, device-based screening tends to be beneficial in those things. But the gold standard says that you must always try to have an objective, accurate assessment of the visual acuity as early as possible, so that you can truly pick up the case who requires further management. So, when it comes to screening, do we need to use all these methods? Which one is the best for us? That is what we need to know. And I think here the thing is that your choice of screening modality depends upon what is your requirement and how feasible that thing is. For example, if you are a pediatrician, let's say, you need not have all these things to screen these children. All you need is just assessment of the red glow, a fixation pattern, or maybe use a simple E-chart to know some idea of the visual acuity, and you are done with your screening. Or if you are an institute wherein you can afford to have devices, then you may use these devices to have better screening of these children. So it is very customizable. At an individual level, what I would suggest is that developing a skill for analyzing the red glow of these children is a good skill for screening these children. And when you combine the red glow analysis along with the fixation pattern and a quick torchlight examination, you can truly screen a lot of children even in busy clinics. When it comes to community examination for a screening of large population, I would suggest, I truly believe that smartphones, they have a huge potential. Once the algorithms get a little more refined, these would be the devices in future to be used for mass screening. Until then, my message is that you can rely upon the traditional method of visual screening assessment, which is going to work for most of us, and at least will help us screening and picking up these children as early as possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rajat. Are there any questions on visual screening? If not, I invite all the speakers to come to the stage for a group photograph. Dr. Kamalji, Dr. Usha, Dr. Shastri,